Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome, one and all, to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month, we extend happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. We count that as anything from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This, as ever, is your devoted host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse film discussion group. And if you've just found our show, welcome. If you're a regular listener, we are thrilled that you've come back. When we think of world cinema and the many unimpeachable classics from around the planet that have been released in the 20th century, it's hard to select a single favorite worthy of the crown best ever made. But if you consult film critics and scholars, a handful of titles rise to that description. One worthy resource to help gauge the grade, ranking, and merits of a masterwork is the British Film Institute's Sight and Sound poll, which asks critics to nominate their picks for the greatest films of all time, the results of which are released every decade. Now, for many decades, Citizen Kane dominated the top of that list, most recently replaced by Jeanne Dielman and Vertigo. But a film from Japan has proven a strong contender over several decades, consistently placing in the top 5, and in 2022, grabbing the number 4 slot. And when directors were surveyed by Sight and Sound in 2012, this work came in number 1 on their separate list. We are talking, of course, about Tokyo Story, released in 1953 and directed by Yasujiro Ozu, a movie that continues to impress and inspire viewers, filmmakers, reviewers, researchers, and academians alike with its moving narrative, emotional resonance, and cinematic craftsmanship. This month, we commemorate Tokyo Story reaching that 7-decade milestone, and we have the ideal guest to partake in this celebration. We'll be joined by David Desser, Emeritus Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois, and one of the world's foremost experts on Asian cinema. If you own the Criterion Collection edition of Tokyo Story, in fact, David provides the wonderfully informative audio commentary that accompanies the disc. David and I will explore why and how Tokyo Story remains a masterwork, its prominent themes, Ozu's unique style, and much, much more. So, where do you start with a crown jewel like Tokyo Story? Well, how about we learn more about the inspirations and circumstances behind how this film got made, when, why, by whom, its reception, and its legacy 70 years onward, with a little help from our friends at Wikipedia. Tokyo Story is a 1953 Japanese drama film directed by Yasujiro Ozu and starring Shishu Ryu and Chiko Higashiyama about an aging couple who travel to Tokyo to visit their grown children. But upon their arrival, they discover that their busy offspring are preoccupied with their own lives, leading to a poignant exploration of family dynamics, generational gaps, and the changing fabric of Japanese society. Tokyo Story was inspired by the 1937 American film Make Way for Tomorrow, which was directed by Leo McCarey, which Tokyo Story loosely adapts to a Japanese context and Ozu's distinctive style. The script was developed by Ozu and collaborator Kogo Noda, who with cinematographer Yuharu Atsuda scouted locations in Tokyo and Onomichi for another month before shooting started. Principal photography and editing took place from July to October 1953. Ozu used the same film crew and actors he had worked with for many years. Like all of Ozu's sound films, Tokyo Story's pacing is slow, although Ozu called it his film, quote, that tends most strongly to melodrama, unquote. In his narrative storytelling, Ozu often had certain key scenes take place off-camera, with the viewer only learning about them through the characters' dialogue. Tokyo Story was first released on November 3, 1953 in Japan. It is Ozu's best-known film in both the West and the East. After the success of Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon at the 1951 Venice Film Festival, Japanese films began getting international distribution. The bad news is that Japanese film exporters considered Ozu's work, quote, too Japanese, unquote, and unmarketable. It was not until the 1960s that Ozu's films began to be screened in New York City at film festivals, museums, and theaters, and it wasn't until the 1970s that it began to be more widely discovered and appreciated by American critics and scholars. Today, Tokyo Story earns a perfect 100% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score is an incredible 9.6 out of 10, and it also garners a flawless 100 Metascore on Metacritic. Now, before I introduce my co-pilot this month, a quick reminder. We will be taking a spoiler-tastic scenic route through this film, so it is in your best interest to screen Tokyo Story right now, if you haven't already, before proceeding forward with us. Everybody get the memo? Great, it's time to introduce our guest, but a quick heads up that the audio on this interview, it's a tad choppy from time to time due to some microphone issues, but it shouldn't detract from your enjoyment and understanding of our conversation. So without further ado, let's give it up for David Desser. Let's give a warm welcome to David Desser, Emeritus Professor of Cinema Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He was the co-editor of the Journal of Japanese and Korean Cinema, and one of the world's foremost experts on Asian cinema for that matter, including the films of Yasujiro Ozu, as evidenced by his outstanding commentary track on the Criterion Collection edition of Tokyo Story. Hello, David. How are you today?
Just fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's such a treat to be able to talk to you today, and I can't think of a better guest for this particular installment where we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of Tokyo Story. So the record show, I guess it was released early November 1953. That would put us in the anniversary month. So my first question to you is, how and when did you initially discover Tokyo Story, and what was your initial reaction? Can you recall?
Actually, I cannot.
Okay.
I would assume that I saw it in a film class when I got my degree at the USC. So I think it was probably around 77, 78. Interestingly, I can remember the first time I saw an Ozu movie. And that was in 1975 when the Public Broadcasting Service did something on Japanese cinema, hosted by former ambassador to Japan, Edwin O. Reischauer.
Okay.
And he showed a number of what were fairly famous Japanese films, but not to me, except for Kurosawa, whom I had seen before. But I remember seeing Early Summer as my first Ozu film. And that's interesting because it's the middle film of a so-called Noriko trilogy of Late Spring, Early Summer, and Tokyo Story.
And why is it called a trilogy? What is it that links these three films?
All three films star Setsuko Hara as a character named Noriko. And in each film, she co-stars with Chishu Ryu, who plays the father-in-law in Tokyo Story. In Late Spring, he plays her father. In Early Summer, he plays her brother. And in Tokyo Story, he plays her father-in-law. So it's typical of Ozu to do that.
But just so I'm clear, it sounds like this is a unique story. It's not continued or picked up the story thread in any other Ozu film. Is that fair to say?
It has similarities, of course, but no. It's just called the Noriko trilogy as a way probably to distinguish his maybe films that are considered his three best, which I actually do. I consider that so-called trilogy his three best, although I'd say Ozu has about a dozen films that are absolutely fantastic.
While we're on that topic, real quick, so what is the top of the heap for you, Ozu-wise? Is it this film, or would you pick a different one?
No, I would pick Late Spring, the film where Setsuko Hara is the daughter and Chishu Ryu is her father. And he needs to basically convince her, and in some sense trick her, into getting married. It's a very poignant film. The father-daughter relationship is very close and very interesting, and it's kind of mirrored in the father-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship in Tokyo Story, where, of course, he tells her that it's fine if she remarries and etc. So there's a lot of similarities in the relationship, and everyone who likes Tokyo Story and knows the film also believes that the relationship between Chishu Ryu and Setsuko Hara is really the emotional core of the film. Where Tokyo Story, it's kind of ironic because she's the only one of the youngsters who's not really related to him.
That's right.
She's only the daughter-in-law.
That's an interesting choice, though, and I have to plead ignorance in all fairness. I've not seen any other Ozu works. I'm, of course, intrigued So these are major blind spots for me, but that's, again, part of the reason I asked the question is I want some other recommendations. So now I know where to turn next, and I certainly will check out that trilogy. But yeah, it's interesting because most people would say this is likely his most cherished work just by virtue of it's the one that the media probably mentions the most. It has been voted by critics and directors as the fourth best film ever, according to the Sight and Sound poll, the most recent version. And it's been listed on that list several times over the decades too. But yeah, it's interesting to hear. In your case, being an Ozu expert, it's not necessarily your personal favorite, but it's close up there, I would assume.
Oh yeah, no, it's a great film. I love it, and it's very, very moving. There's just something about late spring, early summer. There's some others that I like as well. But if you had to pick just one, but there's no reason you have to pick just one because they're all available.
That's right. Yeah, it's a desert island question, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into it here. Why and how does Tokyo Story remain one of the finest films ever made? Why is it worth celebrating 70 years later?
It's its subtle brilliance on the one hand, and its deeply emotional impact, which it very, 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 very subtly. And the reason I think that critics and many people like it the most of Ozu's film is that in some ways more happens in this film than in others. You have the way in which the youngsters are pretty mean to the parents. And of course you have the death of the old woman. So there's a lot going on. So I think people can appreciate that in terms of they're used to most movies in which something actually happens.
Sure.
Ozu called this film his most melodramatic. Most people wouldn't say it's melodramatic, but they would say certainly things happen. But it's just so rich, and I also think it's very surprising. If you've never seen Ozu, this is as good a place to start as any.
Okay.
And I think you'd be surprised at how effective it is with its deceptive simplicity.
Yes.
And it's just a really moving film, even though, the only thing that does happen is the death of the old mother. But in some other Ozu movies, quite literally nothing happens.
Right. It's interesting you say that. Like, some people, Ozu is going to be a harder sell because plot is just a major backseat element. It's not important, and there isn't much that happens, so to speak, if you were to kind of describe the narrative to somebody. But that being said, there is so much emotionally that happens. That's what's fascinating to me, and it sounds like to you too.
Yes, it's so interesting that the parents go to Tokyo, wanting to see their children, and the son, the daughter are pretty cool to them. In some sense, pretty mean. They're disappointed, and their disappointment is palpable. I think that in some ways, Ozu, maybe is appreciated by people who are a little more mature. I'm not going to recommend it necessarily to most, say, teenagers or even 20-somethings, but all you have to do is be reasonably sensitive and pay attention and appreciate. And, you can even take the side of the youngsters. The youngsters have I call them youngsters. Of course, they're grown people. They're in their 30s and 40s even. You can take their side too and say, yeah, they have their own lives, and their parents come and they try their best, but their parents are just not what they have in mind for this moment. And for Ozu, it's not that he necessarily condemns anybody. I think his point really is that it's inevitable. Children grow up and they get estranged. He makes the estrangement quite literal. The geography of the film is important. The kids are in Tokyo, obviously, but the parents are literally on the other side of the country.
Yeah, that's interesting geographically. Like, again, I'm going to plead ignorance. I don't know the geography of Japan. So in the early 50s, for example, how long of a train ride would this be for the older couple to see their kids?
Yeah, it would take hours and hours.
It's an overnight train trip?
No, they even have to change.
Yeah, okay, that's right.
So they have to go south to Osaka, and then they have to go east. Because nowadays they have the great bullet train, but in those days, it was a locomotive train. It would have taken hours and hours. And that's why they all thought they would never. You might say, it's Japan is not that big, and you might say, why do they imagine they never see each other again? It's not that hard necessarily to get from Onomichi, which is a small fishing town, but they know that the travel is difficult, but also that life is going to move on.
Yes,
life is inevitably going to change. Even someone who's nice they
Yeah.
move on.
I ask these questions because I know it sounds like trivial practical matters, like how long would the train trip be, etc. But it factors into the story if you think about it, because I mean, it takes its toll on the mother. Ultimately, she ends up in a coma, she gets sick, she dies. And the train trip going home likely contributed to that. And that's why I ask, I assume trains were the mass transit of the time. People didn't have their own automobiles in a lot of cases. I assume plane travel was virtually non-existent for commuter travelers. Is that fair to say?
Yes, 1953, there were probably only a couple of airports. I don't think it would have occurred to old people born in the teens and 20s to fly.
Right.
Remember, what Ozu does always is he makes his films kind of documentaries of the moment. In 1953, they have to go south to Osaka, where they change, and then they take overnight hours and hours to get to Tokyo. As you say correctly, it did take its toll on the old woman. But of course, Ozu does a little bit of the old Hollywood gun in the drawer, which is to say that he foreshadows the old woman's sickness and eventual death. And he does it twice. The first time is when she's kind of musing to her grandson. And she says, "Oh, I wonder if I'll be around when you get older." And now, the people looked older in those days. They're really only in their 60s. So for me, they're not very old.
I can't speak for Japan, but the average life expectancy in Western nations wasn't that high back then either.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. But the other foreshadowing, though, is when they're in Atami, which is a hot spring, easily accessible from Tokyo even in those days, where they're on the seawall, and she stands up and then she gets dizzy.
Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of the moment. As they say, when you get very specific, you also get very universal. Everybody has a family of one kind or another. Youngsters can appreciate, how they have their own life and let them live their own life. And as you get older, of course, you appreciate the inevitability of change. And that's what I think the film is about. A lot of people say, oh, it's the destruction of the Japanese family by industrialization and how Tokyo has changed, and you get more atomized, and you went from a multi-generation household to a nuclear family. But I don't actually agree with that. I mean, a little bit's there, but I actually believe that the film is about the inevitability of change.
Yeah, we will certainly talk more about this when we get into the issue of themes, but I'm glad you brought it up because it factors into, it kind of overshadows the entire proceeding here and helping us better understand where Ozu is going here. So I certainly want to dovetail back to this thought in just a little bit when we talk about themes. So yeah, as far as why it remains one of the finest movies ever made, as you were saying, I think that it has some evergreen messages, right, David?
Yes.
I mean, it has some time-tested explorations of things like the generational gap, the inevitability of change, as you said, complicated family dynamics, sociocultural changes that are inevitable as time passes. The old being replaced by the new, often irreverently. Thematically, this film is chock full of really interesting messages and takeaways. But the social commentary, for me anyway, it remains relevant 7 decades onward. Tell me if you disagree. But even to those who aren't Japanese or who lived through the immediate years following World War II, it's still relevant. Let's say you're an aging parent, or you're an adult child with a mom and dad in their senior years, or perhaps you belong to a large family, or you have grandchildren, or you've lost one of your adult children, or you live relatively far from your offspring. Or, for that matter, David, if you're a human being with a pulse who finds interpersonal relationships fascinating, then Tokyo Story translates universal truths that will forever speak to you. I'm convinced of that. This is a movie that it doesn't matter. You don't have to be immersed in Japanese culture to appreciate it. I think Ozu does a great job of universalizing the story and the characters. And it also persists as one of the very best movies ever because of its exemplary craftsmanship. He's not afraid to break the rules, right? The rules of conventional film grammar and established cinematic techniques. And he opts for, as you were saying, simplicity and realism with his camera and his editing over things like attention-garnering visual flourishes. He's not a flashy filmmaker.
That's right.
Although he has his unique style, right? So what is it about Ozu's style that listeners should really understand a little bit better, to understand where he's coming from and to better better appreciate when they revisit Tokyo Story or his other works?
Well, he does a lot of things that I think can be enjoyed regardless of the story. It's almost as if it has a story that can be told in any way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can tell Tokyo Story in a lot of different ways. And in some ways, people have remade it, or it's based on things that he utilized aspects of some Hollywood story.
Let me ask you that while we're on that real quickly, is this a loose remake of Make Way for Tomorrow?
It's a very loose remake of Make Way for Tomorrow. Yes.
Yeah, the 1937 Leo McCarey film that hit on a lot of the similar story beats.
It's
Go
so
ahead.
funny because what he takes from there is a kind of set piece that's in maybe 2/3 of the way through the film, where the mother and the father are separated by having to stay with two different people. So the second time the mother and father go to visit their daughter-in-law, only the mother can stay with the daughter-in-law, and the father has to stay with somebody else, the old guy with whom he gets drunk, and then show up at the daughter's home, the one who has the beauty parlor, the beauty salon, the Ooh La La Beauty Salon.
What a name.
Ooh La La. Yes, and then it's a great moment because the daughter, in a certain way, rejects them because she has guests, and she says, "Oh, these are old friends," because she's embarrassed. That's a very interesting moment.
Yeah.
But that being separated is what he takes from Make Way for Tomorrow, in which the old couple can no longer live together, but they have to go live separately. Whereas for Ozu, they don't go live separately. They just are separated. It is, of course, about getting old and the generation gap. And Ozu was a huge fan of Hollywood movies. I mean, he knew what he was doing, and he knew what he wasn't doing. So in terms of his style, he does things that I think a lot of casual film goers and film viewers really won't care about. And what's interesting is they might not even notice, even though it's wrong in some ways. I enjoy watching Ozu's style. For me, I can turn off the sound and just watch the characters flip all over the frame. When somebody stands up from the front, he'll cut to have them standing up from the back. So in other words, the camera will be pointing at them, and then over the cut, the camera will be pointing away from them.
Yeah. I mean, what you're talking about is spatial relationships in relation to what's called the 180-degree rule,
Exactly.
which says that you have to stay, the camera has to stay on one axis or one side of that invisible rule. Otherwise, the viewer can get, disoriented as to, wait a minute, they were facing that way, now they're facing the other way.
Yes.
So why does he break that rule so often? What's the point of that? I'm just curious. Is he just doing it because he can, or he doesn't care about the rule? Or is there something more at work here?
Well, he does it because he can, but also he does it in some ways to anticipate the next shot. So, for instance, in the opening scene, you have the father sitting on the right and the mother sitting on the left. Mm-hmm. He cuts to the other side where now the father's sitting on the left and the mother's sitting on the right. But what you notice is the camera is then looking across them to a different view so that something else can happen in that shot. So somebody actually enters the frame and talks to them. Instead of cutting to that person entering the frame and talking to them, he lets the couple sit there in the wrong orientation, but now we see that someone enters the frame and talks to them. Mm-hmm. So you get a 3-shot instead of a 1-shot.
Yeah, so it sounds like, I mean, he's not just doing it arbitrarily or just because he can necessarily. There's a method to this madness, if you will, in a lot of these choices.
There is. It's just, so that when someone stands up from the front and then he takes them from the back, then he'll let them walk out of the room from there. Mm-hmm. But it is something that he does sometimes arbitrarily, where there isn't any necessary reason, but he does it, and then get used to it. It's in some ways not a big deal, but in other ways it's fun.
Right, like purists or old-fashioned Hollywood directors of the time might have looked at an Ozu film and, what is he doing here? But it sounds like most viewers just get acclimated to it relatively quickly.
I think that a lot of people don't even notice it, interestingly, or they, once in a while it may be a jump. But in a modern film goer, they should probably be used to it, because they've seen all those crazy French New Wave movies where they jump all over the place.
That's right.
So Ozu is very calm compared to Godard or
Yeah. I mean, he may not do the invisible editing that we know associated with golden era of Hollywood, but he's also not doing like radical jump cuts and
no.
flashier techniques. But one of his famous approaches also is the tatami shot, which means kind of a lower camera angle.
Yes.
With the camera anchored maybe 3 feet or so from the ground, and that is a height amenable to ideally framing subjects sitting or kneeling on a Japanese tatami mat.
Right.
That is a very famous hallmark of Ozu.
It is, but what's interesting is that when people stand up, he won't cut so that you'll have somebody tall in the frame and somebody still sitting. And when people stand up, he never pans up. He doesn't track with them inside. He doesn't like to pan. He doesn't like to tilt.
In fact, he doesn't really like to move the camera much at all. He doesn't really track, pan, dolly, crane, or other camera movements. Not that I can point out.
I've counted them. By the time he finished his career in 1962, I would say in maybe 1960, he stopped moving the camera in any respect entirely.
Wow.
In Tokyo Story, there's about a dozen camera movements, but there's nothing that you would say, oh boy, that's terrific. Because I should say it's not very flashy. I mean, it's very simple.
Yeah.
But that low level camera, and I always tell, when I used to teach, I always tell my students, remember, it's a low level, not a low angle. A low angle looks up. The low level is where you put the camera. And I actually took one of my trips to Japan. I went to the studio where Ozu worked, and somebody was shooting an Ozu sort of acolyte, if you will, the most important director of that era, a guy named Yoji Yamada, famous for the It's Tough to Be a Man film series. But he was shooting tatami level. And then I said, oh, that's how they did it. And then I tell my students, okay, guess how they did it. It takes a long time before they come up with one of the ways. It was done in 2 ways. But the most obvious way was the set was raised. They may have been sitting on tatami, but the set itself was a couple of feet off the ground.
Yeah, if you dig deep enough, you find that these great filmmakers, they have tricks. They have ways around the problem.
Yes.
And one of the ways could be, hey, like you said, elevate the set itself.
Elevate the set. Short tripod.
But what's also interesting about Ozu's style, right, is that he places the camera often between 2 subjects to convey a dialogue scene. And rather than employ, traditional Hollywood over-the-shoulder alternating shots between characters, he puts us at the center of the conversation, and that creates more intimacy, right? I mean, his subjects often look directly at the camera, and thereby they're, I guess, addressing the viewer.
Right.
When they speak to an adjacent character, they're doing this. I want to read you something by Roger Ebert, who said in his review of this film that an elegantly refined style like Ozu's places people in the foreground. He focuses on the nuances of everyday life. His is the most humanistic of styles, removing the machinery of effects and editing and choosing to touch us with human feeling, not workshop storytelling technique. People spend a lot of time sitting side by side in an Ozu film. He likes 2 or 3 characters all in a row. If this causes violations of the eyeline rules, sometimes they don't seem to be looking at one another when they speak, he doesn't care, unquote.
That's very true. What he'll do is he'll alternate close-ups, which can be confusing because he does not do over the shoulder. And when he alternates close-ups, they're barely facing the direction that they're supposed to be, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They don't quite look at the camera, but they don't quite look at each other either. That's very, very true. He also doesn't have that many close-ups. The only time he has close-ups really is in conversation. And once in a while, he'll have a close-up of somebody's face just looking sort of pensive or sad.
And I didn't notice any extreme close-ups whatsoever. So he's certainly not going to be like a Sergio Leone or somebody like that.
No extreme close-ups, no extreme long shots of his subject. Extreme long shots can be of landscape or of an alleyway, but his subjects just tend to be in long shot, medium shot, medium close-up. So it is very basic.
Yeah, but for that matter, I mean, he also lingers long on a given character, often for the entirety of their speech or their lines of dialogue. When someone says something to another character, it seems that Ozu's camera it doesn't stray from that subject, right? It doesn't introduce, like we were saying, a reverse shot showing the opposite character's nonverbal reaction.
Right. That's a very astute observation indeed. The person speaks. When they finish, you cut to the next person.
Mm-hmm.
You don't cut back and forth even in close-ups. It's one person speaks, the other person speaks.
That's right.
Ebert is right about the people who sit in a line. But when they sit on tatami, they don't sit in a line, but they don't sit at 180 degrees. They don't sit opposite each other.
Okay.
They sit at 90 degrees. So if people are at the table, you've got one person at one end and the other person at the next angle. In other words, in Western cultures, when you sit at a table, typically you sit across from each other.
Right.
But in Japanese culture, you sit kind of next to each other at this, as I say, it's 180 versus 90 degrees. So he takes advantage of real Japanese life to shoot his movies. He also takes advantage of what I once called modular space, which in the Japanese home has to do with the very, very famous use of the sliding screens, which can create rooms and change their size. So if you slide a screen door, you then have a different room, but you've made the same room. In other words, you can move through a house that's partitioned,
Mm-hmm.
or you can slide the screens and you can have a house that's bigger than it was, the room's bigger than it was in the first place.
You know what really struck me on this most recent rewatch is how Ozu lets shots breathe, if you will, by lingering in an empty room or a space before or after characters enter or exit the scene. And this would have, I guess, defied the Hollywood rule of invisible editing that I mentioned earlier, in which the cuts between shots were meant to be more seamless, smoother, often quicker. So he's letting things kind of breathe, and it's not a strange or off-putting kind of effect that is garnered, I would argue. It's really interesting. It almost feels kind of zen, if you will.
Well, as you say, I think saying "let it breathe" is really again very astute, very excellent. So when somebody exits down a hallway, you don't necessarily cut to them in the next room. Or if they have left the scene, you don't necessarily immediately cut to the next scene. You linger on the empty hallway. You linger on the empty alleyway.
Yes.
You linger on where they were instead of where they're going or where they have gone.
So true.
You linger where they were. So it's a kind of emptiness, which some people can attribute to as kind of Zen-like attitude.
But I also admire how he allows situations and conversational scenes to unfold naturally and, as I said, organically, choosing not to crowd his stories with subplots, turning points, twists, scenes that would detract from the strong focus on emotions and relationships, right? I mean, for example, we aren't shown the grandparents' journeys on the trains.
Right.
Their actual visits to the Atami baths or Tomi's moment of falling gravely ill. We learn about these things simply through exchanges of dialogue. For that matter, David, you ponder how they named the film Tokyo Story, but the city itself is not really extensively shown in the movie, including its landmarks and maybe famous places. Obviously, the children live in I guess it's the outskirts of Tokyo, right? But it's an interesting choice for naming the film.
Well, first of all, you have to remember the tour that they take in the car when they first visit Noriko, and they also mentioned that if they got separated in Tokyo, they'd never find each other again.
Yes, that's true. Mm-hmm.
But it's Tokyo Story in that sense. He has many films called Tokyo something or other. So there is an implication that this new world of Tokyo, this world of bustling, hustling, building is very important compared to the very calm, simple world of Onomichi, where the film starts and where the film ends.
Yeah, certainly.
But it's also kind of a day in the life. This could be any one of thousands of stories or millions of stories that are taking place. But those films are always very elusive. I mean, what does late spring mean? Or early summer?
Well, it's a very specific time of year, but yeah.
It is a
Hmm.
very specific time of year, and in early summer. But it was, and in fact, if you use even the Japanese titles of the movies, you can just get so confused unless you've seen the films. Like, which one is early summer? Which one is early spring? There's a late autumn, so
Yeah.
you can really, So then, as I say, there must be 7 or 8 films of Tokyo, especially in the silent era.
Okay.
He made a lot when Tokyo was really booming.
Yeah, and one more notable element of Ozu's style, of course, are these pillow shots, as they call them, these transitions between scenes using seemingly random long shots of outdoor environments, things like the clouds in the sky, shorelines, cityscapes, other vistas, where other filmmakers may use things like, dissolves or fade outs, fade ins, wipes, to transition between sequences. Ozu preferred poetically visual still life type shots.
Yes, one thing that's interesting is people don't tend to notice is that as the film goes along, you get fewer of those.
Mm-hmm.
But initially, in the first 2/3 of a movie, he will rarely make a direct cut from one place to another that you know. So the second scene in the film is in Tokyo when the son's wife is preparing the house for the visit by the grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
It takes, as I recall, about 7 shots before you get there. So it's like cut, landscape, industrial, bomb, 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 bomb. And it's partly to let the audience know that there is a transition. We're going somewhere else, but it's also to give them a chance to relax, enjoy. I don't think, they're called pillow shots, but I'm not sure that's the best term.
Yeah, it sounds a little confusing.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but just say still lifes in between that generally have something to do with the next scene. So when someone says, I'll meet you somewhere in the city, then you'll get a few shots of buildings, then a shot of an alleyway, then a shot of an exterior of a restaurant, and then the person will be in the restaurant. It's as if Ozu is bringing you to the location by a series of shots that get you gradually closer.
Yes.
Even though the geography per se isn't that important. So if I get a shot of a building, I have no idea where that building is in relation to the restaurant. Doesn't matter.
However, when you see the early pillow shot of the old couple's hometown village, and you see like the pillars,
oh yeah,
and is it the temple or whatever, you are brought back to that image later because he brings that still life shot back, and so you immediately know you are back in their hometown. So there are practical reasons for doing these things too.
Oh, definitely. Well, look at the film's opening. Before you get to the old couple, you've got the landscape shots, and you've got the sea shots, and you've got train shots, which Ozu's one of his favorite shots is just a moving train. Another of his favorite shots is some kind of smoke of one kind or another. So these things are important in setting a mood as well as setting a locale.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you open the film on the old couple sitting in their home, you might get the idea that they have a traditional home, but you won't get the idea that they're in some small town by the sea. So and just when you get the shot of the son's wife, the older daughter-in-law, you get shots of smokestacks and power lines and things like that.
Yeah, and even clothes hanging on the clothesline.
Yeah,
right.
now you know that you're in a different locale, but it does take a while, and it's also the thing that you point out about the train trips is I like to say those shots of the cityscape is the train ride. Because when you get after you watch, and then of course you watch the woman cleaning the house and arguing with her children, and then all of a sudden her husband comes in with the old couple, and she says, "How was your trip? How was the station?" "Oh, it was crowded." None of which you saw.
That's right. We didn't see any of it.
They talk about it, but it's as if you are getting a kind of substitution. There's time spent, and time is also the train ride.
And you know what's fascinating is this movie is over 2 hours long
It is.
at a time where, the typical runtime might be closer to 90 minutes for most mainstream films. I can't speak for Japanese cinema, but you ask yourself, well, if he would have lingered longer on, let's say, the train journeys or things like that, how much longer would this film have been? And I'm not saying it's too long of a film, like I'm looking at my watch getting bored. Not at all. It goes by relatively quickly to me because it's such a riveting human drama. But by adopting this simpler visual style, as we've been talking about, and taking a more efficient narrative approach, often with elliptical narrative, we pay more attention to the riveting human drama that unfolds and the smallest of gestures, the facial expressions, the seemingly unimportant lines of dialogue that so vividly inform us about these characters. Do you agree?
I do agree. And if you're going to show a train ride, then you show one that's really, really important. I mean, what's the point of seeing the old woman fall sick? The point is that she has fallen sick. She's gotten off the train. She's now in Osaka at her horrible son's house, and then they return. But the time you do see people on a train, or at least a person on the train, is in the films in the end.
My argument is that I agree with you, is that, yeah, you could have, if let's say in the hands of a different filmmaker, shown her falling ill and therefore evoking more emotions from the audience. But I think to Ozu's credit, and I agree with Ebert here, who said Tokyo Story lacks sentimental triggers and contrived emotion. It looks away from moments a lesser movie would have exploited. It doesn't want us to force our emotions, but to share its understanding. Now, I'm not going to quote Ebert all day here, but I really was taken by his essay. And I really agree with this notion, because to me, the entire story is infused from start to finish with, of course, this tone of melancholy. It's a little bit more somber. There is emotion tinged to it. But Tokyo Story is not saturated by melodramatic mawkishness to me. It's not. If Ozu really wanted to wring every tear from our cheeks, he would have shown her falling sick. He would have shown her husband weeping, throughout the film, or more conflict between, him and his children.
No, it's true. That's why a lot of people say, how can Ozu possibly say this is his most melodramatic film when it's hardly melodramatic at all? But one does know what he means in that there are confrontations, there are complaints. There is more weeping here, even though it's kind of hypocritical when the older daughter, remember he's got two daughters, the one that lives with him and then the one that has the Ooh La La beauty salon. The older daughter gets very upset when the mother dies and all that. So there is a lot, and the son who's in Osaka, he gives the old Confucian idea, no one can be filial to his parents when they're in the grave, that kind of thing. So there is a little bit of that, although we take it as kind of hypocritical. That's unusual for Ozu, but it may be why a lot of Westerners can get at least a little bit inside what is somewhat melodramatic. And you talk about its relationship to Make Way for Tomorrow. There's a melodrama.
Yeah, certainly. It's a different approach, obviously. I remember Orson Welles saying you'd have to be a stone not to be driven to tears by a film like Make Way for Tomorrow. I think that's part of the point. But again, very different approaches. And on this larger point, to me, I think Ozu paints these characters not in black and white, but shades of gray. For instance, the father, he's docile, he's congenial, he's seemingly sinless, but he's revealed to have been a problematic alcoholic when his children were younger.
Exactly.
And his dead son, we learn, also had a drinking problem. So kind of sins of the father visited upon the son here. The eldest daughter, is it Shige? Is that how you pronounce her name?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Shige would seem to be an irredeemable woman who's ungrateful and selfish. But I am a little bit moved when I see her break down in tears a little bit more vehemently than some of the other characters. Now, she quickly rebounds to her selfish ways relatively soon after that, so I don't feel that sympathetic toward her, but she's not painted as an outright monster to me. And she is concerned that her father might succumb to his old drinking ways, so it's not like she's an unredeemable character. What I'm getting at here is that the older children are painted as less sympathetic, certainly, but they're not completely unforgivable. Many of the reasons they have for, not being able to spend time with their parents, maybe they're valid to some viewers and relatively understandable. I get that the youngest son is not the most filial, and shame on him for not showing up on time. That's bad. But I have to believe him when he says he didn't get the telegram but yet it's an overall indictment of, come on, you should be more tuned into this.
Well, it's kind of ironic and, let's say, satirical,
Mm-hmm.
because the one who should be on time is the one who knows the train schedules.
And he's closest to their location,
Right.
too.
Exactly. So Ozu can be subtly mean when he wants to be.
Mm.
But even the character that we find to be the most sympathetic, and who needs no redemption at all, of course, is Noriko.
Yes.
But remember, at the end of the film, it's a little bit, the subtitles are a little bit off, in that when she has that nice conversation with the younger daughter, the school teacher who still lives at home, when the daughter says, "Oh, isn't life disappointing?" But
right.
what she's actually said right before that is that children are selfish. They're kind of mean, spoiled, selfish. And Noriko says, "Yes, that's true. I'm like that." But they don't quite translate that, because it's a little bit tricky. But in any case, you do get the idea that Noriko is not going to come back to visit her son. Her husband, is gone. He's dead. Noriko's got a life. It's not the most happy life. I find her life to be very sad. But and if she doesn't marry, what's going to happen? We imagine that I like to think about this. We imagine that Noriko won't remarry. But if she won't remarry, she's never going to have any kind of pleasant middle-class life.
I wanted to ask you this real quickly. So what's expected of a widow like Noriko at this time in Japanese history? I know nothing about this. So did society expect her to grieve and stay devout and single in memory of her dead husband indefinitely? In which case, Shushiki and Tomi's expressed wish that she remarry and forget her late husband, that would take on greater significance in this story, right? So
Yes.
What's the expectation for a character like her?
That's a very important question. In the olden days, or in a traditional way, when you get married, you, the woman, then becomes part of the husband's family.
Okay.
You abandon your old family to a certain extent. So in some ways, to a great extent, depending. But remember, if Japan, right, the distances in the old days were difficult. People lived in villages. And so when you became a daughter-in-law, you were the daughter of the family. Even if your husband died, you still tended to live. But in the changing Japan, there was no great reason for Noriko to succumb to that kind of ideology.
Okay.
The father-in-law seems to be somewhat magnanimous and say, go right ahead and remarry. But I think that the reason she won't remarry isn't because she's filial to this family that's basically 1,000 miles away and that she'll never see again. She won't remarry in a subtle way because marriage wasn't that great for her.
Ah, gotcha. I want to ask you, too, about the couple's older children. They can read as cold, selfish, disrespectful, quite unsympathetic to Western audiences. Is something lost in the translation, though, so to speak? Is there something we should know about when it comes to Japanese intergenerational dynamics in the early 1950s that would better explain the attitudes and behaviors of these adult children? Because, again, they are not sympathetic.
Well, this is why people talk about one of the themes being the destruction of the traditional Japanese family. The oldest son does have the filial obligation to take care of his parents. If one or the other were to die, especially you think that the father dies first, typically, and then it would be the son's duty to take care of his mother. Mm-hmm. And it would be the son's wife, i.e. that daughter-in-law, to take care of her mother-in-law, because she's now wedded, literally, figuratively, to the family. So there are changes, and there is the difference between the extended family and the nuclear family. So that is very true. But it is also the case that he is we imagine that doctors are well-to-do. Remember, the old couple kind of complains about the lack of economic success of their children.
Yes.
Which is kind of funny. It compares to this wonderful actor named Eiji Tono, whose son is the one said, "Well, my son, threatened to kill me," and they at least our children don't want to kill us.
Yeah.
Which is a very funny kind of, again, a very kind of Ozu moment. But there is a change afoot. There's no question about it. But on the other hand, doctors in Japan aren't well-to-do. He's a family practice doctor. As you see, he gets called away at all times. His wife has 2 children, And in those days, certainly the mother raised the children. The father was uninvolved. This is, remember, in the early 50s, Japan is struggling to get back on an economic footing. And this is the beginning of the rise of the salary man and the Japanese economic miracle, which would take place a couple of years later, literally when Japan's GDP equaled the highest GDP of the pre-war years. That's when they called it a miracle. We are now back on a solid economic footing. But it took men working hard to do that. And of course, even an unmarried woman would have been called an office lady. So Noriko is an office lady. Notice she's an office lady in an international company.
Yeah, for Bridgestone or something. I saw
Bridgestone
a tire.
tires.
Right. It's interesting.
Yeah, so, and there's a lot of English in Ozu's movie. It's a kind of documentary of its years.
It's just interesting. That's why I wanted to ask you, putting it in context socioculturally for its time. I know we don't have all the time in the world to get into this, but how do you feel about these adult kids? Are they irredeemable, or do you kind of understand them a little bit here?
Oh, I understand them a little bit. They could have been nicer.
Sure.
But they've gotten selfish. I agree.
Yeah.
But they're not irredeemable. They're just, how many people treat their parents that way? Many.
And the other question is, maybe it just doesn't age that well, but this concept of, they keep hammering it over our heads that this old man's now going to be lonely, lonely, lonely. It almost seems like they're rubbing his face in it. Like, what's that all about? Why do they keep reminding him to his face that he's going to be so lonely?
Well, because that's what happens. All his children are going inevitably to marry.
But it seems so cruel that they would keep pointing it out to him.
They point it out with a smile.
Exactly.
But what I love about the ending of Tokyo Story is it's very subtle in the context of an Ozu movie. Late Spring is about a widowed father who lives with his very filial daughter. And Late Autumn is about, a later movie, is about a widowed mother who lives with her very filial daughter. And An Autumn Afternoon is a remake of Late Spring. And in every case, the widowed parent convinces the single daughter who's getting into her late 20s that she has to marry. But when she marries, he will be left alone. That's inevitable. But if people didn't marry, then Japanese life would end.
Exactly, right.
So it's inevitable. That's what it is.
But to me, for a filmmaker who is rightfully described as, subtle and meditative and more nuanced, not so overt, this is very overt.
It is very overt. But the Japanese audience also knows that that's going to be the case in Late Spring and An Autumn Afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
And Ozu does, in a certain way, rub it in. The very, very, very famous final shot of Late Spring is the father sitting alone in one take, peeling an apple. But at the end of Tokyo Story, as I started to say, remember that he's now a widow and he has a single daughter in the house. That's the school teacher, who's now getting to be 22, 23. So you can imagine in a few years that she's going to marry too, and then he'll really be alone.
Yeah. Talk about kicking a guy when he's down. But again, I was a little taken aback by how they kind of rub your face in it a little bit. We get it.
They really don't. I mean, as I say, they say it with a smile, but everybody knows it, right? We think it's not a nice thing to say,
mm-hmm.
but it's also very hypocritical of us not to say it because it's true.
We do have to talk a little bit about themes here and messages or takeaways from Tokyo Story. There are many here. So what are the major ones that stand out to you?
Well, as I say, the two that struggle with each other is the inevitability of change.
Yes.
Also, the changes of Japanese society in the post-war era,
mm-hmm.
where it's getting more atomized. Remember, they had the tradition of the multi-generational family, but that's the farming family in which everybody lives together because they have to work together. And each has a role, and that's how it was.
But also, I'm reading here that there was the institution of the new Civil Code in 1948, right, where much of Japan had adopted Western capitalist notions, abandoned older traditions and mores. That factors into this a bit, right?
It does. And that Civil Code, the biggest change that it made was a great deal around the emancipation of women.
Okay.
Divorce was possible there was a tradition we talked about earlier about a widow never remarrying because of the familial bond.
Mm-hmm.
But post-war era, that was no longer so strong. But capitalism also brings atomization. Instead of the extended farming family, you have the mother and the father and the children with very specific roles of working and child rearing, and then raising your children up to be consumers. He made a great movie about consumerism and this whole idea in a movie called Good Morning.
But your point about the disillusion of the traditional Japanese family and maybe its value system being replaced by a less sensitive, more frenetic, more modernized, industrialized, westernized culture, and that takes its toll because. For example, just symbolically, if you want to assign significance to this, you don't have to buy into this, but you think about the puttering boat at the beginning, the very opening shot. It chugs by slowly, and it's bookended in the film by the closing shot, where you also have a puttering kind of boat. But Shishuki and Tomi and their older, more traditional generation, maybe you can associate them in some ways symbolically with that boat, that slower puttering boat. And that's a vessel that's visually contrasted in the film's opening and closing with what? With a quicker, more urban transport. The train.
Right.
Seemed fairly clear. It represents newer technology, the preferred conveyance of the younger set and the masses. So to me, it fits thematically then that Tomi would become critically ill after visiting Tokyo and heading home on the train. The fast pace of contemporary post-war Japan and the hectic lifestyles of the younger generations, it's a bit overwhelming to their elders. Again, it's just the fast pace of change and how the older set is going to be left behind or not able to transition as easily.
That's right. And at the end of early summer, this time you have a couple that are together, but they have to convince their older daughter to marry. At the end of early summer, the old couple has moved to the countryside, and that's what you get is a very slow procession of a wedding, fields of grass.
Okay.
It's a multi-generational household to begin with, but it becomes atomized when they leave. And your point about the train is also very important, because it's the train that takes the nicest person away from the father-in-law,
Yes.
and that's when Nora goes home on the train.
That's right.
Remember what he has given her. If you want to talk about symbolism, remember the gift that Shikichi has given
The watch.
a watch. And of course, a watch is the passing of time.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like we hear, I don't know if it's just diegetic off-screen sound, but it could be the puttering of the boat, or it could be a watch of some sort, but I hear the ticking going by when he's in that scene where he's giving it to her. But I think it's even before he reveals the watch. So it's interesting what he does sound-wise here, too.
Yes, that's not something often talked about, is the sound design. But you're right. The puttering of the boat is a very significant sound because he doesn't have to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And even the slight whistling. He also likes to have sounds of birds. So a soundscape is important.
We do have to finish the thought on themes, and I think we can agree, right? The generation gap is front and center here. It's about how it's usually inevitable that adult children drift away from their parents physically, emotionally, morally, even ethically. So that's certainly front and center, right? And again, I'm not getting biblical or religious or anything, but you think about one of the commandments, which is honor thy father and thy mother. Maybe the takeaway here is Tokyo Story is a bit of a cautionary tale, David. Maybe it's, hey, appreciate, spend time with your parents and your family for that matter before time runs out and it's too late to form a stronger connection.
Well, that's what Osaka-san says.
Mm-hmm.
You can't honor your parents. And of course, it's not just a biblical commandment, but Confucianism, which is very, very important. But the generation gap, I also think, is inevitable because Ozu concerned himself with that in pre-war movies as well. So I don't want to say that it's the post-war westernization that simply has to do with the generation gap, but the generation gap is, as I think you imply, inevitable as well.
Yeah, it's crucial. It's a crucial message here, as you said earlier, life is often imperfect and disappointing or unsatisfactory. The comment that Noriko exchanges with Kyoko, isn't life disappointing? Or when Shukichi remarks, children don't live up to their parents' expectations. And in that same scene, the older couple comments privately about their dissatisfaction with their grandchildren and the fact that their first child was not a more successful doctor. You alluded to this a moment ago, how their eldest daughter's attitude had changed for the worse. So life, is disappointing. It's kind of a depressing message, but they're being very honest here that the truth is human beings can let you down.
That's right. I like when Tommy says, our daughter used to be such a loving child."
Right. And then, as you said earlier, the transitory nature of life, the inevitability of change is certainly a major theme. The inability to talk frankly with loved ones about problems. It seems like there's such a huge communication problem in this film. Shukishi, you think of him like, why doesn't he speak up more? Why doesn't he like say something that's on his mind? He consistently semi-smiles, he nods, he utters words of acknowledgement. But I discern through context that he's subtly hiding many of his problematic emotions. And there's so much small talk that proceeds between the children and their parents. And, it's very realistic. It's very honest. It's very believable to me. And that's part of what I love about Tokyo Story so much, because there's no speechifying going on here for the most part. There are some greater message that are expressed, of course, between Noriko and some characters. But for the most part, that's the point. The small talk dominates.
The small talk is related also to the kinds of locales that people are in. They're in homes. They're in domestic spaces. Small talk is life, and that's where melodrama makes a big difference. Melodrama is only the highlights, only the high points.
This is like real life. Yeah, it's true.
Right. There's no small talk in melodrama. There's only intense talk.
Yes, exactly.
Life is small talk, small moments. My favorite scene in the movie is between Noriko and Tomi, when Tomi says, "What a treat to sleep in my dead son's bed." What the heck?
Exactly. Well, that's a treat? That seems creepy. It seems, out of place.
Right. But it's a reminder. It's a moment. And remember, all Noriko does is smile. She doesn't say, "Oh, yes, I'm so glad you're happy. And your son was a wonderful guy. And I miss him. And you did a great job raising." There's none of that. None of that kind of thing. She makes no intent. Well, she already feels good.
Yeah.
But and life is ambivalent. And I think that's what we're getting at. We talked about redeeming the characters.
Yeah.
They're not hard. Life is ambivalent.
No, it's true.
The great Jean Renoir said, "Everybody has their reasons."
Yep, the rules of the game. It's a major takeaway that can apply to everybody's life. This year marks the 70th birthday of Tokyo Story, and birthdays are a time for giving presents. Only it's the fans who continue to receive the gifts when a beloved film marks a milestone year. So, David, what is Tokyo Story's greatest gift to viewers?
A chance to look in on another culture that will strike you as your culture. And you will be, if you're not moved by Tokyo Story, you are missing the point. You may not cry, but you certainly will be moved. It's a film of great insight and subtle emotions, but it really leaves you feeling you've gone on a journey. Tokyo Story is about a journey, and you've gone on a journey that makes your life fuller and richer and makes you appreciate the little things in life.
Yeah, I think you're so right. That word appreciate is crucial here, because if you're not moved in some way by the end, maybe thinking about your own relationships with your family, with your parents, with your children, etc., then what's the point? I mean, this should be able to translate this universal message.
Yes, and I also think you can identify with the characters. Even, you don't, even if you don't say, "Oh, my life," your life could be perfect. But, just get in there with Noriko. Just think about her life. Just appreciate, how good people can be. In a world that's changing, some people remain good and loving.
It's so true. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And that's a great birthday message you leave us with here. For my part, Tokyo Story bequeaths film lovers with something priceless, and that is proof that a universally translatable story told simply yet masterfully is ageless, regardless of its creation date. At a time when spectacle, visual extravagance, they're all the rage on screens, large and small, right, David? I mean, when the filmically fantastical and the fabricated, when they trump the true and the real at this time, Tokyo Story is such a refreshing departure. It reminds me that the finest expressions of cinema are often those that present plain but honest human stories, that convey characters that are real-world relatable, right? This minimalistic approach by Ozu and his skill in arousing deep emotions through contemplative, nuanced, unfussy storytelling, it demonstrates that less can be more, and the purity of a simple but powerful tale that is well articulated by an artist who does what? He restrains indulgent impulses. this can resonate much more effectively than flashy filmmaking. So for me, that's the greatest gift of Tokyo Story.
Yes, and it's a film that I think you can watch at least every year.
Maybe late spring, early summer.
All the seasons.
All those seasons.
A great filmmaker's work takes on resonance, not just by the great individual film, but by packaging his films in your mind and making them relate to each other. So you can journey through a whole world of Ozu, and Tokyo Story will still stand out, but it also will take on greater significance when you watch the rest of his films.
And hopefully it's a great introduction, a gateway drug, if you will, to the world of Ozu. Like for me, and all these blind spots that I have to catch up with, now I'm all the more intrigued to visit these other films.
Fortunately, they're available.
So is there anything you're currently working on, David, that you'd like listeners to know about?
I'm working on another Japanese filmmaker named Kinoshita Keisuke, or Keisuke Kinoshita in Western terms, who was a colleague of Ozu at the same studio, and who also very famous for his humanistic way of telling stories. Many of his films are available on Criterion. So once you finish with Ozu on Criterion, check out the films of Keisuke Kinoshita. I can highly recommend them. And in about 18 months, there'll be a book of mine on him.
That sounds great. Do you have a title yet?
Times of Joy and Sorrow, the films of Keisuke Kinoshita.
Oh, that's fantastic. That'll be coming in 2024, you say?
Probably maybe 2025 early.
Okay, still working on it. Very, very good. Keeping busy and staying immersed in the world of Asian cinema. I love it.
Absolutely.
Well, we appreciate you taking the scenic route to Tokyo Story with us this month, David, and for shedding light on one of the treasures of world cinema. It was a great pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thanks again.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
No question. I could sit and talk with Mr. Desser for days. Seriously, he's that good in his expertise on Ozu and Asian films. I hope you found our chat as informative and fun as I did. We will definitely need to get David back on our podcast sometime soon, rest assured. Time now for standing ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers just like you and me. For November, my shout out goes to, of all things, a children's book, and not just any tome for tots, but a new book by former guest and friend of this podcast, Eddie Moeller. That's TCM's resident film noir expert. So get this, Eddie has co-authored Kitty Farrell and the Case of the Marshmallow Monkey. This is a storybook with colorful illustrations that uses animal characters to convey a detective mystery and pay homage to the noir classic The Maltese Falcon. So in this yarn, our feline protagonist, Kitty, is on the hunt for the missing marshmallow monkey artifact, as well as her kidnapped crime-fighting crony, Mitch the Mutt, and she faces off against baddies Casper Nighthawk and Wilmer the Weasel. The fun part about this book is that it not only provides to youngins a first taste of the wonderful world of noir in an age-appropriate way, but it also sneaks in clever references and Easter eggs to noir favorites and classic movies that adults might spot, such as sly nods to The Big Sleep and The Postman Always Rings Twice and Casablanca and On the Waterfront. This hardcover makes a great holiday gift for a grandchild, a youngster who's at least 4 years old, or even a grown-up who's young at heart. Check out Kitty Farrell and the Case of the Marshmallow Monkey, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever you get your books. Did you know that Cineversary has its own website? That's right, we actually now have a vanity URL that's easy to remember, which will take you to a freshly designed portal where you can quickly access the latest episode of your favorite podcast, as well as all of our previous installments. Now it's a lot easier to spread the good word about our show to your friends and family. You simply tell them to visit Cineversary.com. Pretty simple, right? That's Cineversary.com. We also have a custom email address just for you. Now, if you ever want to share feedback on our show or offer suggestions for future installments, or maybe you just have a question about Cineversary, send it to us at cineversarypodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can really help our show grow by spreading the good word about the Cineversary show to your peeps. Even better, please leave a positive online review and rating, which significantly helps us to get discovered by new listeners. So if you use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, some of these other services, simply search for the Cineversary page, look for a link that says something like ratings or reviews, click that link, and leave a review and or rating. While you're at it, take a moment to like us on Facebook. We also have a presence on Twitter. Our handle is @CineversaryPod, where you can easily tweet or follow us. And if you want to go an extra step in your support of our show and help keep us ad-free, please consider making a monetary donation to the Cineversary podcast by visiting tinyurl.com/donate-cineversary. We really appreciate your support. Lastly, have you checked out my Cineverse Group website? Yeah, it's easy to get confused by these similar sounding names: Cineversary, Cineverse, Tomato. But Cineverse is actually the name of my private film discussion group I founded back in 2005 that continues to meet weekly on Zoom. Every week, the Cineverse group watches, researches, and discusses a different movie, and I create a summary write-up, call it a mini essay if you will, on that movie that gets posted to the Cineverse group blog. So if you want to enjoy reading in-depth content that examines different discussion-worthy motion pictures, including classic Hollywood films, independent features, foreign masterworks, modern movies, and silent-era standouts, then visit cineversegroup.com, simply spelled CINEVERSE group.com. Fun fact, every posted article on cineversegroup.com includes a link to a recording of our group discussion of that particular film, with me leading the conversation as moderator. So if you like what I'm doing on the Cineversary podcast, you might also want to give a listen to some of our Cineverse Group recordings, which are podcasts of a different sort. Again, head over to cineversegroup.com, where you can check out some interesting text and audio content on a variety of films, not necessarily celebrating a milestone anniversary. Okie dokie, next month we close the book on another year of Cineversary. That went fast. So what's in store for December? Well, it's that time on the calendar, of course, when holiday films rule, right? So it's only fitting that we fet a cherished Yuletide favorite of young and old. Join us in a month as we honor the 40th anniversary of Bob Clark's beloved A Christmas Story. Until then, this is your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies. They're not getting older, they are getting better. Believe me. Thanks for giving us a listen, and happy Thanksgiving. Gobble, gobble.